Okay, it's actually 9:30 now. We'll just give a couple of more minutes and then we'll just let people join. Thanks. Okay, we have quite a packed schedule today. So we're just gonna start and I think the rest will join in a bit later. So good morning, good afternoon, and or good evening, wherever you are, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fourth and the very last webinar organized by Arafura and Timor Sea's Ecosystem Action, what we call the ATSEA 2 and Oil Spill Response Limited. So ATSEA 2 and OSRL, we have collaborated this year to deliver quarterly webinars. I am Sharina from Oil Spill Response Limited, the facilitator for this webinar. Okay, our hope is to share learning and have a productive discussion through this webinar. Okay, so before we start, I would like to run through the ground rules, before we start proper. Please be respectful at all times. If you are putting in questions through the chat or having any comments, please avoid using all capital letters in the chat. Keep your microphones at mute and your videos off so that we are not causing any lagging issues. Type any messages you have or questions in the chat box and we will attend to them shortly. Okay. Your questions will generally be answered during the plenary at the end of the webinar. Okay, this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available. So I think if you would have really realized, it's also being currently live streamed at the moment. Okay, we will provide you with the attendance and feedback form. So please kindly complete that. Okay, and we'll be sharing it during the webinar itself. Okay, so a quick run through of the functionalities on the Zoom platform. So if you look through, these are the main functionalities. So this is where you can actually mute or unmute yourself when you need to speak up. But if you're not speaking up, please ensure you're on mute. Okay. We don't think you will probably need this one, but this is where you can start or stop your video. We highly recommend that you keep your video off to maintain the internet reliability. Okay, so this one here, the chat function is probably what you'll be using for in this webinar. So if you have any questions at any time, feel free to type in your questions on the chat icon. Okay, if we do not have time to address it in this webinar, we'll be releasing an intranet article for you to be able to see the answers to these questions that you have. Sharing screen, not something that you probably need also, but these are the reaction. This is the reaction button if you would like to share any reactions. Okay, that's a quick one. Okay, so for today's webinar, we have the honor and pleasure to actually have the following resource speakers with us. So we have Mr. Dwi Ari Yogo, UNDP National Project Coordinator for Indonesia. We have Ms. Hon Pui Huang, OSRL's Aviation Liaison Officer. She'll be talking to us about two topics. We have the oil wildlife response as well as the oil spill risk assessment. Okay, and last but not least, we have Ms. Pak Ondy Christian. He's the head of Agency of Environment and Forestry of East Nusa Tenggara Province of Indonesia, and he will be sharing with us a case study in this webinar. Okay, so to start off this webinar, I would like to invite Pak Yoga, who will provide us an overview of the ATSEA 2. Pak Yoga, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, Sharana. So
we cannot hear you, Pak Yoga.
Okay, you could hear me? Hello? Okay, I think it's your earphones. So let me could start for the. I want to share about the project ATSEA introductions. So if I could share the screen. So my name is Divya Yoga Utama. You could call me Yoga. I'm the National Project Coordinator for Indonesia as part of a UNDP Indonesia programs. We're talking related to the what is ATSEA. We know that this is the fourth webinar, and we always sharing the program itself. But let me want to reintroduce our programs. Why we working in these issues. So ATSEA 2 is stands for the Arafura and Timor Sea Ecosystem Action Phase 2. This it's starting. There is an initiation from the expert forum in Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and also Australia in 2006. They want to learn more about this region. You could see that's a blue color. It's Arafura and Timor Sea. It's part of the large marine ecoregion from Indonesia, Ireland, and also North Australia. In the first phase, we are more identified what is the potential in these locations and what is the big gaps among the region. And then we developed the transboundary diagnosis analysis, and then we implemented the action plan in the phase 2. So in the phase 2 itself, we already start from February 2019, and will be ending by 2024. So why this area is matter? We know that we have a high biodiversity ocean in this area, different with the other region of Indonesia that mostly have a high biodiversity of coral reef. But in Arafura and Timor Sea, it's more different marine ecosystem. It's more related to mangrove, one of the biggest mangrove in Indonesia, and also high potential of the demersal fish, shrimp, and other pelagic fisheries. But in other way, there's a lot of overexploitation of the marine resource. Before, there's a lot of illegal IUU fisheries, and also we see that there is a loss and degradation habitat and biodiversity because utilization of the community and also from the big vessel in the area from different countries. And the other thing,
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. We are not seeing your slides at the moment. Do you have them up?
Yeah, I'm already share screen.
Okay, because it's not appearing on our screen.
We can see the slides.
Oh, you can. Okay.
So it's a map. You could see the slide in the map.
No, Pak Yoga, we're seeing the ATSEA 2 slide. Maybe you would like to stop share and reshare again, please?
Okay. Okay, so let me start again.
Apologies.
No worries. I think it's
Okay, hold on. We're seeing something. Okay, Sharina, maybe you would like to stop share first. Okay, now we're seeing a map project overview. Is that the
Okay.
correct slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So
Please
I
hold
will,
on.
yeah, I will follow up here. So the other issues in the region is land-based marine pollution. So we see that's a lot of oil rig in the Timor Seas and have high potential if it's a leak. And also there is an impact of the climate change. We know that in Indonesia part we faced on the cyclone like Saroja, and it's gonna be other cyclone going to the Katulistiwa, yeah, going to this area. So this project itself managed by Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and also PNG, and supported by the Australia to addressing the transboundary issues. Related to specific program itself, we have 3 major components, 9 expected outcomes, and 23 target outputs. Component 1 is related to the governance management. So we will learning from the process like CTI, CFF, and we also want to facilitate the regional government to develop the regional governance mechanism, and also it will be linked with the national mechanism. Yeah, we will be updated the potential of the area and also the issues in the area to support the action plan from among the country. And also in component 2, we work closely with the management of environment itself. So we know that there is 4 main issues that we work in environment and biodiversity. It's related to improve management of fisheries and coastal resources, reduce marine pollutions, conserve coastal and marine biodiversity, and also integrated coastal management, incorporating with the climate change adaptations. And the last component, we're working for knowledge management. So we want to transfer the knowledge among the country. We know that the eastern part of Indonesia has a different approach. It's more related to the traditional knowledge, traditional management of the area, and how the policy will dealing with and integrated with the local policy and local belief. So that's the things that I think the ATSEA one of the major project that link in this region. And for this webinar, we will be focusing on the output 2.2 related to reduce marine pollutions. We want to enhance data information regarding to source and seeing of contamination in ATS. So speaking of that, we have the second year of our implementation. We have assessment on the marine and land-based pollution by Dr. Sintai Wang in 2021. There is 2 main issues in the region. Of course, it's marine leaders. I think it's happened a lot of the water. Yeah, it's big issues in the global one. And the other things is oil spill. If we could see in the map, there's a lot of consequences of the oil and gas in Timor Seas. So there is a high risk of biodiversity if this consensus not managed very well. But from the country itself, we have to prepare how to handle the risk in these waters. In detail assessment, everybody could download in our report. You could scan the report, or also you could visit our website in the publications part. About this webinar objective, we're working with the OSRA to support us to preparedness of the oil spill preparedness in the ATS region. And with this webinar, we want to enable information sharing among and build capacity of the ATS stakeholder and oil spill preparedness and response. The topic itself is progressive related to awareness of oil spill impact, the understanding oil spill risk, and what it takes to respond to oil spill incident effectively. And we also want to introducing the key principle involved in the preparing for responding to oil spill incident. Yeah, we see that this is the serial webinar. The first one we already talked about cause, fate, and impact of the marine oil spill. And then we also have discussed on the oil spill strategy if it happens. And we also have a webinar specific on the NEBA or spill impact mitigation analysis in PNG case study. And the last one, for the last webinar, we goes to Indonesia. So we have, will be discussed on oil wildlife response. So how the oil spill will be impact to the wildlife and how we gonna manage those impact, and oil spill risk assessment. And also we want to sharing the Indonesian oil spill case study. This comes from East Nusa Tenggara Timor. This is we'll be talking about the Marine Pollution Task Force as one of the two from Indonesia side that have provincial level team to handling risk from the oil spill in the regions. So I think that's from my introduction from the ATSEA project. Everybody could reach us in the website for more detail about the project itself, and you could also contact me as well. I think that's from my part. Thank you. Back to you, Stephen.
Okay, thank you, Pak Yoga, for your welcome remarks and also for providing us the background of ATSEA 2 and the preview of the webinar. So now I will just quickly share my screen back. Okay, so with that, we'll move on to providing a quick background of oil spill response. Okay. So oil spill response, or OSRL, is the world's leading global oil spill response specialist since 1985. Okay, so we are wholly owned by our members, which comprise of oil, gas, and energy companies, and they represent the majority of global oil production. Okay, so our members actually gain access to a full suite of OSRL's expertise for their response and preparedness needs on a global basis. So we have offices and as well as warehouses that are across the global projection, of course. So who we are, again, we are the largest international industry funded cooperative, and we are owned by major oil and gas production as well as transportation companies. Okay, and we provide resources, not just equipment, but as well as expertise, as well as skill sets to prepare for and respond to oil spills efficiently and effectively on a global basis. Okay, and with that, to all participants, you can actually proceed to type in your questions in the chat box as early as now or later during the presentations. So do not worry if your questions are not read or not answered today. We will actually release an online article after this webinar to actually answer all the questions that you have in this webinar. Okay, so what you see here on the screen is an attendance and feedback form that is my administrator will actually have it shared. The link will be shared in the chat box later. Okay, so you can actually fill this in and I'll explain a bit more about it later. Okay, so without further delay, our first presenter is Ms. Pui Huang. So the first topic that Pui Huang will be presenting on is on oil to wildlife response. So Pui Huang, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sharina. So just give me a few minutes to share the PowerPoint slides first. Sharina, we need you to stop sharing this. So give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides. Ready? Thank you, Rachel. I can see that we have the slides shared. So good day to everyone. My name is Pui Huang. I'm from OSRA, so just a brief introduction that I'm currently the Aviation's Liaison Officer for APAC regions. But prior to that, I am also a duty manager for response, in the sense that when you call in for an event of oil spills, I'll be the one handling your call and talking to the incident commanders, or even to help to give technical advice in the IMT, or to send our people and equipments over to the site. So today, I think we start out with oil wildlife response. So I think this is, if you're familiar with the tiered preparedness and response wheel, so oil wildlife response actually falls inside one of the factors, together with the at-sea containment and recovery, shoreline cleanup, waste management. So oil wildlife response is one of them. So the agenda for today, I will have it is to understand at least on the effects of oil on the wildlife, because able to give you a broad overview on the wildlife response, preparedness, to understand what's involved in the oil wildlife response. So it started off with the effects of oil on wildlife and what is an oil wildlife response exactly. What are the response strategies available to minimize these impacts? And we'll come to understand the importance of preparedness to ensure an efficient and effective oil wildlife response in an event of oil spill incidents. So effects of oil on wildlife. So most common casualties of oil spill are the marine mammals, seabirds, and sea turtles due to their physiology and behavior. A few ways to get exposed to oil will be through direct contact, inhalations, and ingestions. So physical coating of oil onto their skin, mucous membrane, fur, and feathers can cause skin and eye irritation, suffering from chemical burns. So mammals also rely on their fur for thermal regulations. Thus, oiling reduces swimming ability and the mobility out of water. This affects the ability to hunt for food and lead to starvations. On the other hand, seabirds have feathers to serve as waterproofing functions. So oiling leads to water logging and results in loss of buoyancy, causing them to suffer from hypothermia or even drowning. So birds in general love to print on its feathers and get the oil onto their body, making them sick, developing gastrointestinal problems. Same effects when marine mammals and sea turtles ingest oil into their bodies. So in long run, there will be chronic effects on their tissues, organs, or even reproductive functions. So damage to their respiratory systems by inhalations may lead to the immunosuppressions. So in all, overall, I think they bring down their immune systems and make them fall sick more easily. So on the other hand, the oil spill response actions by human interventions can cause adverse effects as the wildlife are driven away from their habitats and suffer secondary impact from inhaling the smoke generated from the vessels and power packs. So effects of oil on wildlife does not stop during the oil spill incidents, but years to count on. It may have impacted the wildlife populations level as discovered from the post-spill monitoring. So I think there's a few case studies that you see here. So the first one is the Exxon Valdez. So sea otters experience high rates of fetal and neonatal loss. So I think this also in the European Czech colonies following the Prestige spill, the annual reproductions was around 70% lower than the historical rates, up to the 5 years later from the spill itself. And lastly, I think it's the very well-known deep-water horizons in the Gulf of Mexico. So the bottlenose dolphins in the northern Gulf of Mexico found their reproductive success was a tip less than comparative populations in the 5-year studies. So I think these 5-year studies, but the effect is like ongoing, and we do not know what is the exact impact that will cause to the population levels. So, however, it's actually difficult to determine the specific mechanism of reproductive impairment in observational wildlife studies, because there are factors that may constitute because to the environment, not necessarily only oil spill, by the plastics or the pollutions in the current, I would say that modern world. So, but definitely once an incident happened, the post-spill monitoring will have to carry out, and to a certain extent, it can help you to measure the impact to the wildlife in that region. Another indications that you can measure the impact or the effects on wildlife would be the carcass recovery. So it's usually used as an indicator in measuring the impact on wildlife, but it is actually difficult to measure the actual impact. So why would I say so? Because you can see that there's different factors in the diagram. In many cases, you only can see what you see. So the carcass may sink to an extent, and the wind current conditions may bring the carcasses away from the shore or even deeper down from the original spill locations, or some dying underwater that you may not be discovered anymore. And later you can see that when they are strained on the shoreline, it can be a remote stranding where it's not accessible by humans, and you're not able to see that to recover any carcasses or the scavenging by the other predators in the regions. So I think all this will constitute to a limited accuracy for the impact on wildlife, but nonetheless, I think it formed the baseline data to help us understand the effects. Yep, so moving on, I think that's like give you a brief introductions on what are the effects on the wildlife. The first, how they actually get impacted through contacting with the oil. Second, what is actually how we actually measure using the carcass recovery as well as the post-spill monitoring to measure the actual impact, or at least close to whatever we can discover. And moving on to exactly what is oil wildlife response. So there's a definitions by APICA IOGP guide. So it states that it is a combination of activities that aim to minimize the impact of an oil spill on wildlife, such as birds, mammals, reptiles, by both preventions of oiling when possible and mitigating the effects on individual when oiling has taken place. So it is a broad definition that encompasses a wide range of activities from initial preventative measures through to mitigating impacts on oil animals. So an oil wildlife incidents can have complex problems. So I think one very headache and complicated ones will be the wildlife will not be able to understand what you're trying to tell them. They will not understand English or Malays or Indonesians native language or any kind of language that you're trying to communicate with them. So I think that itself already make one very complex problem to solve, because they will not listen to whatever you would want them to do. And secondly, I think poor level of preparedness in terms of, do we actually have an existing oil wildlife plans in place? Do people know their responsibilities and roles in dealing with the oil wildlife, or they don't know how to deal with them? So do we have actually adequate resources in terms of trained personnel, equipment, or facilities to house all these oil wildlife? And the number and types of wildlife casualties can actually make a difference. Imagine even a small spill can have a large impact on wildlife. It depends on the number of species or the vulnerability of the species being impacted. So even though there's only a small populations, if there's in the region or that seasons is a nesting seasons or migration seasons for other shore birds or other seabirds to come in. So I think that can actually greatly increase the complexity in terms of managing oil wildlife. Animal welfare issues or the local legislations. So in terms of priorities in certain species to receive treatments from others, or euthanasia is one of the options that you want to consider. Is it in the plans? Or do you only want to decide when things happen or when the incident happens, then we are talking about it? But many of times, what are the priorities in certain species to receive treatments will depend on the, I think, will be from the top down, from the, I think, the national agencies, the environment agencies to advise, or prior to that, do we actually have a list of the vulnerability list or endangered species list that we already have on hand to decide which type of species will get the priority treatments. Humanitarian issues. So it's to protect the public from distressed wildlife, which may attack people, or even the members of public contact disease from the sick, direct contact with oil without proper PPE, or even the oil wildlife suffer from more stress and damages from the poor handling by untrained personnel. So I think this both ways, you want to protect the animals from the untrained personnel by causing more harm than good. And secondly, also to protect the public by the sick and maybe dangerous wildlife in this sense. And when the public want to help, whether they are having the appropriate training and PPE equipped before they actually step in to handle the oil wildlife, or are they trained to handle the oil wildlife to prevent themselves from getting injured. So one good case study I would like to share will be the Rena spill in New Zealand. It's actually considered as one of the successful oil wildlife response in these regions. And how is it so? So I think we trace back to when it happened. So it happened in October 2011 at the Bay of Plenty. So MV Rena was grounded and approximately 350 tons of HFOs were spilled. So the wildlife response in total lasts approximately around 5 months. So at the height of response, we are looking into 250 people being involved. So what are their roles? They can be even doing all the daily wildlife operations, including the field staff, doing the reconnaissance and collections, or working at the wildlife facilities that care for the birds, or support staff that is actually consists of the management, logistic, planning, and the human resource. So I think in total, we have around 420 live oil birds collected and taken into captivity for decontaminations and rehabilitations. So out of the 420, I think 383 are the little blue penguins. I think many would know that the blue penguins is one of the important, I think, species in New Zealand. And with the 383 birds emitted, 365 have been released back into the wild, constitute to 95% success rate, which is very high. In addition, 60 northern New Zealand doctorals were preemptively captured. However, 6 died in the captivity. So you think that the 60 numbers maybe is a relatively small number, but actually it constitutes around 10% of the total populations in New Zealand. So I think that can cause one of the alarm for having these endangered species to be harmed by the oil. As such, also over 2,000 seabird carcasses have been recovered. And the success was built on the multi-year preparedness effort by Maritime New Zealand and ATSEA universities. How is it so? So I think just give you a background information. The wildlife response is fully integrated into New Zealand oil spill contingency planning. And the mobilization of the wildlife response in this, I think, Rena incidents will be actually shortly only after the ship was grounded. So I think by day one, the information gathering, assessments of the spill site, of the vessels, or even mobilization of the equipment or wildlife equipment has started. And by day 2, I think there are actually few teams being mobilized to go for search and rescue, or even for collections of oil wildlife in the region. And the oil wildlife facilities has also been mobilized, or at least to step up. So all the facilities, be it permanent or temporary, has been identified in the plan. And from the day of mobilizations, I think simultaneously reconnaissance and collections of the data, field team being sent out to do surveys and to do collections of activities, and also the setup of the wildlife facilities has been simultaneously, concurrently being activated. So by day 3, the wildlife facilities are ready to take in the oil animals, and the first oil bird has been emitted. So as you can see that with such a large or huge demand on the logistical requirements, I think MNZ, I think in terms of the mobilizations, I think, and escalations procedure-wise, they have did it and together to handle the oil spill incidents at the same time. So I think that caused the success to the wildlife response, I think, or wildlife response. So it's something that for you to take note that it's important that people actually know what they are doing and the resources are already readily available when in times of need. I think with that, we can dive into what are the wildlife response strategies. But before that, I have one small activities for everyone. So I have these 3 pictures. They actually individually, they represent different kind of wildlife strategies for you to match the pictures to their corresponding wildlife response strategies. So I have Rachel that will put up a poll. Then you see this into these 3 areas, which is the primary, secondary, and tertiary. So with now, I think please cast your votes to think what is picture A that match to. Is it a primary, secondary, or tertiary? Or B is a primary, or B is a secondary? Or even C to you is a tertiary, secondary, or primary? So please, can I have your votes in? So far, I only have 1 participant, so the rest are able to do. Rachel, I see that the poll has ended. Is it intentional?
No, actually it ended by itself, but let me just launch it again. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, yes.
Okay, let me relaunch it.
Thank you.
All right.
Now, thanks everyone. So I need your contributions. Help me to cast your votes again. Yeah, I can see the votes are coming in. Just make a guess on how these pictures match to the response strategies. I'll give a few more minutes, maybe 1 more minute to go. I have over 50% of 50% of participation rate, so I just need a few more to cast your votes and see if you get it correct. Okay, we can count them down. Maybe 5, 4, 3, 2. Last chance to get your votes in. And Rachel, you can end the vote and the polling, sorry. Thank you. So I think you can see the results. So let me just see. We have a few different choices. So most of them voted for the third one, tertiary, primary, and secondary. I also have other choice on primary, secondary, tertiary, tertiary, and primary. So I think the actual answer is the majority wins. So the first one is actually for tertiary, B it's primary, and C will be secondary. So let me explain what are these 3 strategies actually about. So I think for primary, you can see that I think we always want to keep the oil away from the animals. That's always the primary strategies. So how can we do so? Is actually by oil spill response measures, which means that you want to control the oil from at the source. So you do source control, or in terms of what the area of it may be spilled, like the offshore ATSEA containment and recovery strategies to prevent the oil from spreading or cross contaminations into other areas or be it the shoreline. So I think the first we're looking into the corner response. At the most initial part will be the source controls, or then slowly you build out to what are the different strategies to keep the oil away from the animals. Definitely you want to do surveillance and monitoring to see what are the oil wildlife being impacted and where are they impacted. So to what extent they are impacted. So this is done under the primary side to get informations and data collections. So I think that's what just now the MNZ or the RENA spill is about. So the day one they start on data collections. Since day one they start on the data collections and information gathering. So for part two is on the secondary. So you keep the animals away from oil. So through the hazings and deterrents, also by displacement, which means that preemptive captures. And third will be the tertiary, which is to mitigate the impact on the oil animals, so that will include the capture and rehabilitations. So we will cover each strategies in the subsequent slides. So as I mentioned about the primary to keep the oil away from the animals, so the surveillance and monitoring. So who will you want to get involved for the data collections? So for sure you want to have the wildlife response experts, the taxonomic experts, the local biologists, or reporting from the infield response operations. And you want to identify the species at risk or the real-time location of wildlife, sensitive habitats, or the seasonal variabilities. Example, just now I mentioned the nesting. So I think this is important, and it can be concurrent when I would say that IMT sends people for, I think, shoreline or for the SCAT shoreline cleanup assessment techniques to survey the shoreline, what is impacted to the shoreline. So at the same time, I think you also can have a task force or a task team to work together with these SCAT team people to get your wildlife response experts inside the SCAT team people to do the survey at the same time. So you actually can consolidate the efforts rather than you need to request it separately or you don't know when to put your request forward. So it's important that you actually have people to also mention on all wildlife response in your incident management team. So I think all these can be collated and also be consolidated effort to concurrently when they handle an oil spill. So secondary will be to keep the animal away from the oil. Just now we mentioned about some hazing and deterrence methods. So it's actually a controlled disturbance to deter wildlife from contaminated or at-risk areas. So, but you have to keep in mind that the hazing and displacements are not a silver bullet because its effectiveness can be limited and can decrease over time with habituations. So the birds is always, or the animals sometimes will just get habituals and they will just keep on revisiting the same place over and over again. So once you only do hazing one time, but over the time, I think the birds or the wildlife will just keep coming back to the same spot, then they get used to the noise, get used to the lights that you actually use to deterrence or to disturb them. I think from there, I think the effectiveness can be limited already. So regular monitoring of the effectiveness is the key. If not managed properly, you have to manage properly because also you do not want to guide the birds into the oil areas. So all these will have to be trained, or the noise introduced has to be at a certain controlled decibel. You do not want to damage or to cause harm to the animals as well. So depending on the habit attacked and the species, hazing and deterrence may not be a viable response at all. Or if the species are very susceptible to stress, so once you disturb them or they cannot react properly to stress, it may cause them to suffer and in the end eventually die of the stress. So these are decisions I think not made lightly. So you require expert knowledge or even lessons learned that can be brought into play. So huge logistical undertaking, also the chance for some animals may die. So just to be careful that all these should seek, I think, the wildlife experts I'll say that advice, and to see whether for different type of species, I think different methods will be used altogether. And moving on to the tertiary response. So it involved a variety of response actions that span from the field to facility activities with the intention of releasing healthy, viable individuals back into the wild populations. So it is important to understand the resources required to be successful. So in terms of the personnel, in terms of the equipment and facilities, or the time actually you are given to. So you can see that it's from the field ops. I think the activities here will be the capture of the live or animals, collection or evaluations of the dead animals. You need people to transport from the field sites to the facilities, and you may want to set up a few stabilization stations in between if it is too far from the facility site, or then moving on to when they reach the facilities, you want to take on the intake and emissions. So every wildlife should be registered, given a number, have their own record. Then before they move into the pre-care, pre-wash care or the animal care supports, then when they are really strong enough to at least endure the cleaning, which includes washing, rinsing, and drying over several times before they actually can do to pre-release care or do the conditioning to get back to their healthy state. And lastly, to release them back to the wild populations, and we'll do a post-release monitoring. So all this process needs time, and in the average, we're looking about 2 to 3 weeks per animal. Definitely, it will depend on the type of animals, type of species we are handling, or the conditions of the wildlife at the moment or at their state. So these actually are often underestimated and require pre-planning. So you can see that there's a huge logistical demand to just when you take in the wildlife. And another part or a bit sensitive is the triage and the euthanasia. So triage, as I mentioned, is to prioritizing treatment of animal, can be based on the resource limitations, because you have these limited facilities or the equipments that you can treat the animals. So you will need to prioritize what are the species to get treated first. So usually it will be either by the endangered species and the livelihood of the survivor, or to support the populations. So in the sense that you look into their age, the reproductive status or sex. So in many of times, I think they will prioritize to treat the adults over the young, because I think there's higher chance for the adult to survive compared to the young, and the adult are actually ready for the reproductions or reproductive stage. So euthanasia will be the act of inducing death in a dignified and humane manner, with minimum of pain, fear, or distress to the animals involved. So this will be under part of triage, which is critical to the herd health. This, I would say that it's part of triage, but it's not limited to only triage. It's actually being evaluated at every stage, be it whether at I would say that the pre-care, or even go to the cleaning, or even up to the I would say that post cleaning, where you need to monitor whether what is their survival rate. So I think euthanasia is also being evaluated throughout the stage for, I think, many been written in many all wildlife plans, but these are some things to get consensus and agree with the response teams or even the government wildlife agencies. So that should be detailed in your national plans on the use of euthanasia as an option. So some, I think, countries already have this in place. So when in times this happened, then the vet or the trained personnel will know what to do and they are authorized to do it. So all these will be recorded and should not be taken lightly, I would say that. But if there's a policy in place, it will help things easier rather than you decide on the spot itself. So I've covered the 3 response strategies, if you can remember the 3. So it's the primary, secondary, and tertiary. So definitely we want to prevent the oil to get to the animals. And secondary, you want to prevent the animal from getting to the oil. And third, if they really impacted, so what are the mitigation measures to take care of the oil wildlife? Moving on to critical components of a wildlife response. I think there are several factors that you can see here. Definitely first is you want to talk into the health and safety, which you want to protect the people from getting hurt or hurting the oil and vulnerable oil wildlife. So do you have actually the safety plan in place? Appointed safety officers, are the people trained to do what they're supposed to do? Then do you provide the training and do you provide the appropriate PPE to protect the people? Then secondly will be the documentations. I think good documentations is important, be it for the compensations or the future studies or investigations. So it can be in the form of paper or electronic records. This is often, I would say that people find it tedious, but it's a very crucial, I would say that steps that you need to do, because many of times people want to learn back from the past histories or past lessons learned, or at the same time when it comes to a dispute, all these documentations will become handy in terms of what the decisions made, why do you actually, in what basis you make all these decisions, have it been recorded, has it been discussed? So good housekeeping of the documentations is important for dispute, be it for the authorities, for the organizations, or even with the public actually questions. And lastly, I think the communications, so strong and smooth communication is crucial with the stakeholders involved. So internal for efficient response, external for reassurance and the reputations of the company. As you can see, I think the bottom left pictures, there's actually some setups on the lightings, people are getting interviewed. So this is actually real, I think, examples. It's a CNN reporters to check out, I think, the Macondo, the Deepwater Horizons response. So they are being, media are being invited to view and to understand the rehab process and up-to-date progress on the oil wildlife response. So this is important, as you know, nowadays, anyone can post anything on the social media, be Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and people may interpret the message wrongly. So rather than waiting for the media just to interpret by the pictures, so it's good for the responding party to invite the media from time to time to give them a good view on what's been done on site. And these can prevent any misunderstandings or outrage by the publics of the responding party not doing anything. So rather be open, be honest, and also to be well informed for the public is important when you're managing any response, be it on wildlife or on the dispute handling. In terms of the oil wildlife response facilities, there are, I think, a variety of accepted approaches. So, but it all required pre-planning. So delay in the establishments can lead to increase in mortalities. So a plan for the rapid establishments of a temporary or identifying a permanent facilities is a critical element for any response plan. So in terms of the permanent facilities, you can look into is a purpose built for oil wildlife, or is adaptable for oiled wildlife. Example, you have in the country, there's wildlife rehabilitation facilities that can be used. Then in terms of temporary facilities, we are looking into building of opportunities like a warehouse or temporary structures, the McKee tent. So all these will need to source for your vendors, your suppliers, and in the peacetime. So in the actual, your incident management teams will just need to take out the list of, resources or the contact numbers. They can just make their call and mobilize the necessary suppliers to form these temporary, or even give a call for the permanent facility that you say that you want to step up the facility to handle oil wildlife. So I think that will require all the pre-planning. And the requirement for the establishments also includes big space. So to actually house them before, during, and after cleaning, rinsing, and the drying process. And you need to have conditioning pools before release, and therefore you will have the access to the water, electricity, and gas. Good ventilations and proper waste management are also important. So in terms of be it for the waste of the animals or handling the oil wildlife animals, so I think the biohazards kind of the equipments, the syringe and needles, feeding tubes, and it should be separated out from your normal other waste. So your waste can be a human waste of the PPEs, of the food waste that you will need to take care of. So all these should be segregated properly, and set up security to ensure minimum disturbance to the oil wildlife, and also to safeguard the response personnel. So in many times, I think people have high tensions on the oil wildlife. The public may be concerned, they want to visit, but they do not know that they may disturb the wildlife, because in times like this, they are usually very stressed, and any kind of noise may add further stress to all these wildlife. So it's important that you keep it in a very peaceful, very calm environment in order to aid in the root corporations or to get back the health for the wildlife. I think the last part is looking into the planning for an wildlife response. So it's important that we look into the wildlife response preparedness. So what we did just now, or what we share about the strategies, what are the critical components during the response, is what we do during response. But do you actually have the trained people? Do you have the facility and the equipments to prepare you to handle such wildlife response? I think it comes into the investment in preparedness. So it's critical to the success, as we already mentioned, that there's huge logistical demands and short window of opportunities to successfully capture, rehabilitate, and release wildlife after oiling. Sometimes, as I mentioned, the number one complex problem will be the wildlife will not know that you're actually helping them. They cannot communicate with you. So the oil animals, if you're not able to identify them and to capture them, to send them to the facilities, it may actually fly to another regions to cross-contaminate in the shoreline or other species during the course that they escape from you. However, I think you need trained people or experts to help you to identify the distress, I think features that they have. As if you recall, there are several types of how the oil can get into the animals. I think first is very visual, which is smothering effect on the fur or the feathers of the oil wildlife. But if they actually like oiling, like they going through inhalations or ingestions, there's something that you cannot be seen, which you would need the wildlife experts to really identify the irrational behavioral of the animals. I think that will be crucial to identify that they may be the species that need help, or in return they maybe have really contacted the oil or ingested the oil that will need some medical care. So the wildlife response plan provides a roadmap for people to follow through the response So a successful and effective response will depend on the competent personnel working to a well-developed plan that has been adequately resourced and regularly exercised. So there's some questions for you here. It will be, do you have actually an all wildlife plan? Do you actually have enough or the response capability in terms of personnel, equipment, and facilities? So these are some questions that you need to think about. And if you do not have it, I think it's time for you to start to develop one and integrate into your be it your corporate or the national oil spill contingency plan. I think with that, I think some key takeaways for these sessions will be oil wildlife response is an integral part of oil spill preparedness and response. And there's a brief window for success, so initiate the response early. Just like the RINA case studies, they actually initiate from day one. Then the complexity of oil wildlife is often underestimated because the logistical demands and the attentions on the public and the media for the company to handle. And lastly, I think require development of preparedness through exercises and training and the engagement with all stakeholders. So with that, I think this is the end of my presentations for oil wildlife response. So back to you, Sharina.
Thanks, Prihong. Yeah, I think I have just a quick question for you. So I think if I recall many years ago, the concept of wildlife response, at least in Asia, was very much still like a novel idea. But I can see that it has slowly gained a higher priority over the years. I think my question would be, what do you think is sort of like the biggest challenge when it comes to oil wildlife response in this region, like, at the current moment, for example?
It's a good question. So I think I never can emphasize the message that I have talked through during the presentations. I think one important part will be the oil wildlife response plan. Many organizations, in fact, they do not have it in their oil spill contingency planning. I think good examples will be in terms of what they have integrated into their oil spill contingency plan is the New Zealand. I think another country will be Australia. So it's, I think, mandatory for the organizations to include oil wildlife response plan into their OSCPs or the OPEC. I think Australia is known as OPEC, the oil pollutions emergency plan. So I think once they make it, I would say that be whether compulsories or their high awareness to incorporate oil wildlife response plan, I think these will help or will gain the awareness for many organizations to take notice of the huge logistical demands, be it the trained personnel, the facilities that is required, the big space just now we talk about, and as well as I think lastly the equipments. All these require specialized equipments, special trained people to handle oil animals. It will be another skill set apart from handling oil itself.
Okay, thank you so much, Prihong. I think that's a really interesting session. So I think to all participants, if you have any questions, do not wait till the plenary session. It will be addressed primarily in the plenary session, but do type your questions in as early as now or anytime during the presentations. Okay. So we are actually fully utilizing Prihong's expertise for today's webinar. So the second presentation is also going to be by her, but her topic now will be about oil spill risk assessment. Okay, we'll just give her a couple of seconds or a minute to just drink up some water, and then she will proceed with her session. But for the rest of you, can you please check your chat box? We have already shared the link to the attendance and feedback form. So you can indicate on the attendance form whether you require an electronic certificate. So we request the participants to complete and submit the form to us after the webinar. Okay, so Prihong, over to you whenever you are ready.
Thank you, Sharina. So just let me share my slides. So welcome back. It's me again. So it's not deja vu, it's not going back to oil wildlife response, but we have another topic, which is the oil spill risk assessment. Don't worry about that. It's totally a separate one. You will not get confused. I will say that the topics will be very different, and the concepts we are talking about will be I would say that, will be different. But I think oil spill risk assessment, I think it gives you even more way back to the fundamentals, to where we should do beginning, what are the focus that we should have. So I think oil wildlife response is also form part, I think, of it when we do our oil spill risk assessment. So welcome back to the second sessions by myself on talking about oil spill risk assessment. So just want to be sure that you're able to see my share slides. Can give me a thumbs up. Thank you. Okay, I can see. So I shall begin without further ado. So for the next 40 minutes, we'll be looking into the oil spill risk assessment. So what would I want to achieve for these sessions? I think first part is to understand where OSRA, which is the oil spill risk assessment, lies in the context of planning process. Second part, you want to understand the overall process and steps of the oil spill risk assessment. So the first part, the planning process, it is the question always begin with, how prepared are you to handle a spill? So just now, this is also the formula that will never go wrong, that you should actually keep it to heart, and a successful and effective response will depend on the competent personnel working to well-developed plans that has been adequately resourced and regularly exercised. So there are many components. You can see that it's 4 components to make the success, to make an effective response, be whether you handle the spill and the oil wildlife response. So this is the planning process. So you can see the fact from the develop scenarios to develop of the response strategy. So your oil wildlife response strategy actually is the second part. So the first part, the OSRA actually comes before even you develop the response strategies. Then moving on to determine the response capabilities, put into your contingency plan preparations. Then with the plan, you conduct the training as well as exercises to make sure people know what are their roles and responsibilities. Do you have enough equipment to station there? Then lastly, to review and update. So I would say that even OSRA forms at the beginning because you need to develop your scenarios. You want to know what is the oil spill risk that's involved. But I would say that this process or oil spill risk assessment process should be revisit in every component, be when you develop response strategies, determine response capabilities. Because any change to your oil spill risk, which means that maybe change in the operations, change in the situations, change in maybe your assets, or even maybe change in personnel, that will cause you to revisit or to reevaluate the oil spill risk assessment. So I think that's a very brief and broad definitions. So moving on to the process, there are 7 steps, as you can see now, and it's also in a continuous improvement loop. So this is developed by the guidelines from the Joint Industrial Project. So there are the steps listed down for 7 steps. So first one, to establish the context. So these were the purpose of the risk assessment, to cover the extent, be whether per project or per organizations, or the people conducting the RA will be identified, as well as the methodology to conduct this RA. Second will be the hazard identifications. You know that identification by maybe site audits or even by your operations, using different kind of tools, which we discuss. Third, livelihood analysis. So with the the hazard being identified, you want to know what's the likelihood that these hazards can happen. What is the probability of the spill occurring? Then fourth will lead into what is the consequence in these aspects. So if it happens, so you have to determine the risk by calculation from maybe the modeling results or even by the sensitivities, the resources at risk in your regions, and to give a value to what is the severity of this impact. Fifth will be to establish and evaluate the risk. So the risk come from, later you will know that it's something about the risk matrix tables. Is the likelihood versus the consequence. You want to rank the risk identified against the risk metric. So either it can be a client specific or a general, or even it's a national effort or national indicators. So for the risk reductions, on number 6, it will be to identifications or the approach to reduce the risk. So you have your risk being identified, be it whether now you know that you rank in terms of high, medium, low. So do you actually want to drive, or you have to drive the high to the medium to the low, or the low remain low? So the last part will be the input to the oil spill planning. Rachel, I don't need the poll now, please for later. Yeah. So there's the last part will be the input to oil spill response planning, where I think what's the information gathered from the process and feed into the overall planning process. As you can see that you will need to the next stage to develop the response strategies, to identify what is the response capabilities. So I think the last part will be the information that will be gathered and feed into the outside this loop for continuous improvement. So let's begin with the first step. So how we actually establish the context of the assessment. I guess see breakdown to objectives, scope, methods, boundaries, and risk tolerance criteria. So the C's criteria. So I think the main objective of conducting the OSRA is to determine the onshore or the offshore activities, or both. They are in line with the corporate risk tolerance. So this is achieved by identifying, categorizing, or evaluating, and lastly presenting the risk. So other objectives also can be used to support for decisions making, or is it a basis for approval by regulatory authorities, or is a basis for stakeholders communications. So I think it depends on what is your objective, but the main thing is definitely for this is to determine the offshore activities or onshore activities that will be in line with your corporate risk tolerance. For scope wise, I think it's really to identify and evaluate the risk to the environment from the accidental oil spills. So the environment, we are looking into the ecological and social economic factors. So it can be beneficial to communicate with the relevant stakeholders to ensure the scope of assessments meets the needs of both the operators and the relevant stakeholders. The method adopted will be from the best practice and also the industrial practice in the geographical region and also the regulatory regime. For this, I think for next will be the boundary. So you want what to be included or not included in this assessment. If not, I think the whole world is your boundary. So you want to limit to what is being related for this assessment. In this case, will be the oil spill, maybe limited to your area of operations, or what is the time of your campaign. So all this is the boundary that you will need to set for your assessments. And lastly is the risk tolerance criteria, which means that the risk level should be measured against the ecological and social economic risk tolerance criteria. So it's actually defined by the maximum likelihood of a certain consequence which is tolerable for the operating companies. So I think with that, then you establish your step 1 to define the context of the assessment. So after which, I think that will lead to a series of the key questions. So what can go wrong and lead to the potential release of oil? How likely are the identified scenarios and what happens to the spilled oil, what are the key environmental receptors, what is the risk of the environmental damage, and lastly, how is the established risk utilized in oil spill response planning. With all these questions, you will be guided and you'll see that how it will lead to the step 7. So step 2, you will, once you set the context, you will want to identify what is the hazards. Okay. So it's stated with the facilities and operations. So I think hazards, as we all know, is anything that is a potential to cause harm. So you want to study what can cause harm to your facilities and operations. So what are the threats or even the circumstances which may trigger hazardous events. So you want to identify the potential characteristics of the hazardous events and identify potential preventive measures. So I think potential characteristics may be, is it the offshore activities or is it the onshore activities? So what is inside your facilities? Is it the terminals and ports? Or maybe it's the offshore rig platforms or the wellhead platforms. So do you have the vessels that's traveling or the FPSOs, collisions, pipeline leakage? So all these activities that can lead to oil spill, it will be considered one of your potential hazards identifications. So you can see that on the right, you have actually the pictures on all the offshore activities in the ATSEA. So you can break into, I think, the step-by-steps. So just as mentioned, if, example, you have a port or terminal activities, you want to list out any scenarios that can lead to oil spill. Then after which, you want to have deep dive into the details. Examples, what kind of oil we are looking into, what is the quantity likely to spill in the worst case scenarios, and what is the characteristics of oil? Is it very persistent or is it a very heavy oil? So all these should be, I would say, that document down. And lastly, if the oil spill were to happen, what will be the resources at risk in your nearby regions? So you look into the environmental and socio-economic or cultural factors. So some tools that can help you is the hazards and operability studies, which is the HAZOP, which is the hazard identifications, or even the failure mode effect analysis, the existing data that can help you to identify the hazards in your region or the area of operations. So the output is to list out the hazards, but we exclude the likelihood or the probability or the consequence at this stage first. So you just list out any or every type of hazards that associates with your operations or facilities. So after which then we will, I would say that, do the likelihood and the consequence in the subsequent step. So how you need to document it, so you can actually use a spreadsheet for the ease of reporting, reference, or sorting out. So one example that I think I will show it here is just for illustration purpose. So some activities that's happening at sea, which is the shipping activities, oil spill explorations and productions. Perhaps there are some inland facilities like the oil terminals, ports, etc. Using the map on the right. Then you actually populate to the information just like I mentioned. So what kind of port or facility activities that happens in the region. So maybe there's an oil storage and distribution. So that is the purpose. Then what's the possible oil spill scenarios? Well, because you have vessels to come for unloading, loading. So they may be has a chance for vessel collisions and the tank may breach and resulted into the loss of product in the tank. So what kind of oil has been released? Maybe it's a light oil, gasoline, diesel, bunker oil, or even the marine diesel oil. Then what are the volume that we're looking into? Perhaps give an estimate what is the tank capacities or what's the worst case scenarios they can have. Then what are the characteristics and other informations, like is it a continuous, because maybe only one tank is breached but the other tank is unstable and may breach any times, or actually when the vessel collisions, it actually hit the pipelines beneath and there's a chance that there will be the leakage for the pipelines. So all these you can actually put it in. Then the location and that long that's important, so that certain at a later part can do a modeling trajectory to see where if were to leak, then where will be the movement of oil. And lastly, you want to know what is the environmental and social economic sensitivities nearby, whether you actually, I think many times I've heard that this fisheries is very important in this region. There are any other important fisheries around your facilities or operations that you need to take note of, or maybe other ports and terminals, also the nearby regions that can affect their operations as well. So it's good that you actually document down or be using a spreadsheet or any form of I'll say data management. So with the hazard being identified, you can look into the livelihood and any consequence, because you will know that actually risk is actually measured against with livelihood and consequence. So the number sector 3 will be on the livelihood analysis. So what we are talking about livelihood analysis. So livelihood is actually what is the chance of hazard events happening. So what are the chances? It's just like in being in that region, you will give in terms of vessel collisions. So what are the chances that you will happen vessel collisions in your operations or your facilities? So it can be based on statistics, which is quantitative, and also qualitative will be based on the experience from relevant historical events. So quantitative will be looking into numbers, looking into details. Qualitative maybe will be lesser, but I think it will be relate more to experience, or even in these regions, the local knowledge, or even the industry, I think experts, not industry experts, as well as this industry or all others like collections from other companies. So that can be also relevant to help you in your risk assessments. So lastly, I think you want to establish relationship between your current operations to the livelihood. So I think some data you can use is maybe the oil spill data, or even the failure and accidents data that you want to collect or to get hold of before you want to establish the livelihood, or like be it in your organization. If you have organizations in other regions, do other regions also have such incidents happening, be pipeline leakage, tank explosions, vessels collisions in their regions? So all these you will need to have some data gathering before to make your, I would say, the analysis on what is the likelihood that this hazard may happen. So the likelihood of an event and the potential quantity of discharged hydrocarbons are the two main parameters contributing to the risk from an event. So an assessment should be taken to select those events to be taken forward in the OSRA and to define the oil spill scenarios to be modeled. So in this sense, that I think to put into perspective will be like, if it's a spill condition I mentioned, so there's a breach or the tank can be the valve, there's a valve to immediately shut off, then maybe the maximum leakage will be, I'll say that 100 ton or 100 barrels, because I think the valve can immediately shut off, the ESD can usually shut off within 1 second, I think by the standards. Then the minimum leakage from the pipe will be only like 100 barrels, as compared to maybe vessel collisions that the tank has breached, cannot control, and maybe it depends on the tank capacities, 1,000, 10,000s of tons of oil has been leaked into the environment. So it, compared from 100 barrels to 10,000 metric tons, you will want to prioritize that, you know, the heavier, or I mean the large quantity of oil can actually or probably the happen of tank breach can be, you need to evaluate on certain oil spill scenarios that you will need to be modeled. But being said that, I'm not saying that you want to rule out that the scenarios that only can cost 100 barrels. So in the discussion wise, all scenarios will have to be listed down. But in terms of your risk assessments, you want to focus on the certain highly, I would say that horrible likelihood to happen oil spill scenarios to be modeled or to be in further, I would say that discussed and have put in place the preventive or mitigations measures to it. So in this sense, all events will have to be, I would say that brainstormed and listed, but those potentially have a significant contribution to the risk should be considered and have defined the oil spill scenarios to be modeled. So I would say that including those likelihood, low likelihood, but may have high severities. So example, if I say that 100 barrels, it's the small, so I think it's in terms of the, I would say that you can compare 100 barrels and 10,000 barrels, you want to focus on 10,000 barrels. But if this 100 barrels is always like maybe happen like every month, the frequency is like every month, or likelihood that it happen is very high, then you want to actually put inside in your oil spill risk assessment. So sometimes I would say that the double hit, I would say that double edged swords, where which you can see that small quantity, but you always have always frequently happened, you want to actually consider. And sometimes like this, it's low likelihood, but you have a high impact. Example, the unlikely the tank will breach, and then unlikely there will be explosions, then you don't want to consider, which is wrong, because even though it's unlikely that it can have explosions, but the impact is great, you would actually need to consider. So all events here, I think, should be considered and for the likelihood analysis, so nothing should be ruled out, and it will be up to the organizations or the stakeholders together to discuss what should be included and what should be given for the mitigations measures. So the aim of the selection process is ultimately to provide a risk basis for oil spill response. So with that, I think we will move into the consequence analysis. So the consequence of the oil spill to the resources at risk. So resources at risk, just now we mentioned there's ecological or environmental. So you want to see whether there's the bird colony, any sensitive shorelines, be it mangrove, mud flats, or even the rocky shores. Then second will be the social economic activities, maybe be it the ports, terminals, tourism, fish farm, fisheries. And lastly, consider the cultural, which is the temples, place of worships. So these are the factors that you want to consider, that which is the resources at risk. So how you determine the consequence value? You require the estimations of the likely fate and the trajectory of spill oil through modeling and in the marine and the coastal areas. So you can see that the fate of oil, if you are familiar, there's the weathering process, which means that once oil spilled into the environment, the evaporation can take place, emulsification may take place depending on the oil type, spreading of the oil, dispersions, degradations, sedimentations, or even the oxidations. So it will depend. So you want to do a modeling to see where is the movement of the oil that will go. So the general rule of time is being affected by the wind and the current, and we have those software, the oil trajectory software to model the direction of the oil that they may go in a few days' time. And identifications of the environmental and social economic resources, which in short, the resources at risk, will be all those potential environmental receptors. And lastly, to evaluation of sensitivities of the environmental receptors and the identifications of those to be used as the impact indicators for determining of the consequence values. We can see this chart here. So how we categorize of the resources at risk, it can be into three types. So biological, shoreline types, and socioeconomic resources. So I think for the first, biological features will be those about the living resources and their habitats, including the marine lives, birds, mammals, which includes those endangered or protected species. Then the shoreline types is generally described in terms of their substrate, so sediment size and wave exposure, so like sandy beach, rocky shores, mangroves, mud flats. And lastly, the sensitive social economic features. So this represents the human use resources and can include fisheries, and be it whether fisheries, which is the commercial fishing, the harvesting, the fishing villages, or even the aquaculture, tourism and recreation areas and activities. So you can actually populate it into another, I would say that tables, and the consequence levels from very low to extremes. So with the establishment of the livelihood and consequence, you will now able to establish and evaluate the risk, which is the main bulk that I'm going to talk about. So you want to map the livelihood and consequence onto the risk table. So what is a risk assessment matrix? So actually it's a visual tool that can depict the potential risk affecting a business. So the risk matrix is based on the two intersecting factors. So one is the livelihood, and the other is the severity, which is the consequence. Then in other words, and then it's a tool that can help you to visualize the probability versus the severity of a potential risk. So depending on the livelihood and severity, risk can be categorized as the high, medium, and low. So as part of the risk management process, I think companies use risk metrics to help them prioritize different risks and develop and appropriate mitigation strategies. So it can be this risk metric can work in many forms. So be it whether strategic, operationals, financials, and externals. So it works by, you can see that it's by a chart and the color code by the severity. So high risk, you can see it's in red. Then the medium risk would be the amber or orange. And the low risk usually in the yellow. So I think the color code is defined by the organizations. So no right or wrong. And every risk matrix has two axes. So one is to measure the livelihood and the other one is to measure the impact. So whatever the parameters you set for the risk events, on the livelihood and impact, the risk assessment metrics will provide a quick snapshots on the threat landscape. So you see for these risks or the hazards that you identified, where will it fall into high, medium, or the low risk category. So we look into what is the value or how should we tag along with the livelihood. So you want to select an appropriate rating from A to E for each oil spill scenarios. So A can be, you never heard of it in the industry, to all the way E happen more than once per year at the locations. So this is these categories or these 5 categories are used or adopted by most companies. No, like I said, that is actually a discussion with your stakeholders. You don't need to stick to the A to E exactly like it is. It will actually depends on the I would say the needs or the operations requirements or the setting for your organizations. So with that, I think prior you collect or you want to give indications that if you've never heard in the industry, do you want to tag a percentage to it? Or maybe it's a highly unlikely kind of scenarios, maybe it's a less than 10% chance. So I think the percentage share is indicative. So like I mentioned, it's always a consensus with your stakeholders. So be heard of it in the industries, or you say that it is maybe unlikely that it will happen. So first be highly unlikely. Second, B can be just unlikely, which is heard of it in the industry. Do you want to tag a percentage to it? Maybe more than 10%, less than 40% or 30%. That happen in your organization more than once per year, or happen in your organizations or more than once per year in your industry. So you want to tag maybe C is the likely or possible to happen. Then you can give a tag of 40% to 60%, 40% to 50%. Then you're moving on to the next one. It's likely to happen at the locations or more than once per year in your organizations. Do you want to give a higher percentage range? And lastly, happen more than once per year at a location, giving this possible is a highly likely to happen. What is the percentage that to your organization is considered as highly likely? Above 80%, above 90%. So something is to be agreed upon. Then you will select from A to E. Same to the consequence analysis. You want to change another indicator, maybe it's 1 to 5. So 1 will be a slight impact to all the way extensive international impact. So select an appropriate, so it's 1 to 5. So the factors to consider will be any biological sensitivity nearby. Just like I think we mentioned the 3 factors. So do we have the seabirds? Is it a turtle nesting areas? All these will be considered to the population sensitivities to disturbance. Also, you will want to include the resilience to oil pollutions and the ability to recover after oil pollutions. So the consequence is that whether your seabirds are resilient to the oil pollutions and the ability to recover after the oil pollutions. Same with the turtle nestings. So all these is like, then you tag and you consider whether what's the impact and give a rating from 1 to 5. For shoreline sensitivities, I think we are looking to like, what is the holding capacities for the oil? How effectively is cleaned by the natural mechanisms? Or whether is it like, as compared to one example would be the oil persistence on exposed high energy rocky shores versus the I would say the mudflats or the marsh or the wetlands or mangroves. So I think the high energy rocky shores will be substantially, I think, less persistence for the oil than the mangroves. Then lastly, I think any socio-economic sensitivities nearby, like the fisheries, tourism, water intakes or ports and terminals that can affect the operations or other people's livelihood. So I think all these elements will be need to consider when you want to do the ranking for consequence analysis. So with that, I think the establishment of the risk will be combining the likelihood value and the potential consequence of each scenarios. So this is a 5 by 5. Just now I think mentioned from A to E and 1 to 5. So you can use other metrics if you want to expand to 7 to 9 to 9. But that will be you have to be more, I would say, that defined indicators for your metrics. 3 by 3 is rarely used, not saying that it's not possible, but because it will bring a lot of your risk into a high or medium and low. So having a more widespread metrics will give you a better indications. So you identify the scenarios that is low, medium, and high risk, and can be a basis for prioritizing of the risk. Meaning, if the scenario and after you give the rating falls to high, for sure you want to reduce the high into the medium range. Then from the medium to see whether you have any mitigation measures that you can move from medium to the low risk regions. So whatever remain low should have continuous monitoring every year for your risk assessment to make sure that it's maintained low. So anything that's high, definitely you want to see have additional controls, any mitigations measures to bring it down to medium as much as possible or as low as reasonably practicable. So I think that's the approach that we usually use for risk assessment. But if it's a high, then definitely you have to educate the people what are the additional controls in place so that people will get to know if the risk is not able to reduce and is essential for the operations to carry out. So the risk depends on the likelihood, how likely a hazard events that can happen. So the consequence, just now we mentioned, consequence to the 3 factors, the resources at risk, or even to the volume of oil, the type of oil. If it's more persistent, like heavy fuel oil, which is more persistent, and the effect may take longer to recover, or the shoreline will take a longer time to recover from the persistent oil over the light oil. Then others is also how prepared are you to combat the spill? Do you actually resources, be the equipment or people trained to handle the oil spill, or even the migrations of the shorebirds, the seabirds, or even the monsoon season, the northeast monsoon, southwest monsoon, do you have actually an impact on your region of interest? So we have one, I've explained on the, I think, in terms of do the hazard identifications. Then with that, you will develop your oil spill scenarios and you want to rate your oil spill scenarios risk in terms of livelihood and the consequence, which is the impact. Then you match against the risk matrix tables. So now is your turn. I have an example here. So based on the scenario provided below on the left side, which is the example of the terminal operation, which is the oil storage and distributions. And there's a possibility of the vessel collisions as the oil spill scenarios. The type of bunker oil release will be the bunker oil, and the volume is 1,500 metric ton. Characteristic is actually continuous after collisions. Then environmental and social economic sensitivities will be the nearby ports and terminals and the fisheries. So with this information provided, just have a guess or do your own risk assessment rating. What will be your risk rating be? So using this 5 by 5 on the right side, you have just consider the factors you have that I listed down here. How would you rate the risk rating? Is it a high, medium, or a low? So I think with Rachel, you can launch the poll now for people to put in their votes. Yes, so you will see the low, medium, high. So for these given scenarios and the data you have, how would you actually rate this risk? So there's no right or wrong test for these answers. I want to say just now, I think many emphasis on it's always agreement by stakeholders. Then there are actually other informations that you want to collect from the the operation itself. But just based on these scenarios, what for you, how would you rate this risk? Is it a high, medium, or a low? So don't worry that there's no answer. I would say that there's no right or wrong answer for this, but it's just for you as you go through these risk assessment activities, how would you yourself will view these hazards or view these oil spill scenarios? You just make a guess. So I have 3 participants answered. Some people will read it as a high and some read it as a medium. I think Rachel, it is again being ended. The poll is ended. So do you want to reopen again? Yeah, keep the votes coming in. So I now have on pause, some view as high, 50% of the answered participants have high and medium. Any other more? So we have more high now than medium. Let's give a few more minutes for more to participate. Okay. I think we can counting down to 10 more seconds. Okay, we can end the polling now. So thank you for those participants. So we have the votes on 8 of 5 actually view it as a high risk and 3 view it as a medium risk. Mentions that there's no right or wrong. So I think we can revisit one slide before this. Yep. So I think we're talking about the risk depends on the likelihood and consequence. So with that, if you want to rate from the likely that you will have the events that taken place in your organizations that you actually heard of, vessel collision is common, and you can hear from the news, have been the oil spill incidents is constitute to the vessel collisions, the shipping incidents. So I think you probably that maybe the likelihood that you give it higher. Then the impact maybe at your regions, 1,500 compared to the oil maybe for this instance it is a bunker fuel, maybe it's a less persistent oil, then you feel that the consequence is not as severe as compared to maybe the HFOs. Then your nearby, I think the ports and terminals, or you have the resources already in hand at your area. So once it happens, you're able to deploy the resources and help it out. So you may view your I would say the impact on severities to be lower. So that give you maybe a moderate impact that you do not need that you're able to handle within local resources. They would say that it's the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 resources. So in all, there's no right or wrong. So for those people who actually view it as a high risk or think that it's have high impact and high severity, high likelihood and impact, so you want to bring it down to the medium and later to the low risk. So I hope that everyone has at least a good idea. So with the hazard identifications, you do your likelihood and consequence analysis, then match it up with a risk metric table. And last two components with the risk reductions that I will go through, I think, quite briefly. So as mentioned, what you want to do, how you actually can reduce the risk will be either reduce the likelihood or you reduce the consequence to the event. So I think you want to introduce the mitigating measures, see whether you can actually push down to the to a lower risk, or you're looking into the hierarchy of control, elimination, substitutions, engineering controls, administrative controls, or last part is the PPE. So how to actually can introduce the mitigation measures to reduce the risk, the likelihood. Sometimes if you're able to prevent it from happening, yeah, you can't. So all these is the two factors because risk is measured against consequence and likelihood. So something for the organizations to look into. So for definitely from the high risk, you want to drive down to the medium and the medium to the low as much or as low as reasonably practicable. So some activities you will look into or the methodologies will be the preparedness and the response. Then also incorporate into your national and the regional oil spill contingency plans. Definitely regional corporations. So if you do have your own resources, do you actually have the nearby terminals and ports have it, or even your nearby the rigs? They actually have to do I think collaborations or cooperatives, or do you actually tier 2 resources or tier 2 organizations you can tap into, like in like Malaysia is the PMAC, Indonesia is the OSCTs, or subsequently there are actually others kind of tier 2 organizations that you can tap onto, which is under the regional corporations. So that is you'll be looking into your risk reductions. I think lastly, how you put everything into I think the real oil spill response planning. So I think with all the risks being identified, then what will happen? So example, the vessel collisions, you want to actually deploy booms So do you actually have the I think the shoreline booms being impacted, then you have the shoreline booms, or the offshore booms, you have the offshore booms at your place? So what kind of resources you want to I would say that equip with or to hold on to? So I think it will come from your risk assessments. So for the risk assessments, you will know and you come about to do the selections of your response strategies. So I think with that, I think comes to the end of my sessions. So in a nutshell, I just want to, I think the key important message is always a continuous improvement for risk assessment. It should be, I would say that assess and evaluate from time to time, or there's a change in events or your operations personnel. Yeah, which is very important. And lastly, how actually a very simple steps in how you do the risk rating, which means that you will need to identify your hazards, then do a rating for likelihood and consequence with your to map into the risk matrix tables. So important that do your organization or the national site have a risk tolerance criteria for you to do the comparisons or to do the risk matrix mapping. And lastly, all these inputs can help you to decide in the future in terms of the development of the response strategies, as well as the subsequent, I would say that the resource capabilities to hold in your organizations. So I think with that, thank you for having me to present on both topics. I hope that these are two different topics, and you will learn at least some key message from myself. Thank you.
Okay.
So back to you, Sharina.
Thank you, Pui Huang. We will proceed to the next presentation. Pak Ondy is not able to join us, so there is Ibu Sulastri who will be presenting a case study for us, case study in Indonesia. Ibu Sulastri, are you able to share your slide and if possibly on your video? I'm aware that there are questions coming in for Pui Huang, so I'll get her to address these at the end during the plenary session. But just keep your questions coming in, yeah? Okay. Ibu Sulastri, to you, over to you.
Ya. Selamat pagi. Baik. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi. Salve, Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam sehat dan salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Sebelumnya, saya menyampaikan permohonan maaf. Harusnya pada pagi hari ini materi penanggulangan pencemaran dan kerusakan lingkungan laut di Provinsi Nusa Tenggara Timur harusnya dibawakan oleh Bapak Kepala Dinas Provinsi, Kepala Dinas Lingkungan Hidup dan Kehutanan Provinsi Nusa Tenggara Timur, Bapak Ondy Siagian. Namun ada satu dan lain hal, maka saya ditugaskan untuk mengikuti membawakan materi ini.
Can I just check if there are any slides or if there's any translation? Ibu Sulastri?
Materinya sudah dikirim tadi.
Anyone from ATSEA who will be sharing her slides?
No,
we have it.
Slide-nya sudah. Slide-nya tadi saya.
Maaf Ibu, dikirim kemana Ibu?
Slide-nya tadi sudah dikirim ke panitia. Mas saya kirim. Udah ada di saya juga. Ada. Kirim ke? Kita sudah kirim di ini siapa tadi di IPIN. Sudah kirim di IPIN tadi. Kan? Iya.
Can I just check in with ATSEA if there's any? I know Ibu Sulastri is presenting in Bahasa. It seems anybody is able to translate that, or who can take over the presentation in English, because we have participants coming from other countries who might not be able to understand in Bahasa.
Oh, ini
Wait, Serena.
Sure. Okay.
Tekan ini satu. Baik. Nah, tekan ini, Bu.